So welcome everyone watching the recording. You're listening and watching the Compassion in Action webinar, Caring for Others, Caring for Yourself. We're just getting started this evening. We've got a really amazing international audience joining us. Thank you everyone that said hello in the chat box. We're just going to start the, before we go into kind of hearing from the amazing presenters we have this evening, we're just going to kind of take a moment to have a short grounding landing meditation. And the idea of this is that we want to offer a quiet space for reflection before we go into a lot of kind of talking and connecting and sharing ideas. And it's going to be very slightly longer. If for those that join our webinars regularly, it might be very slightly longer than our usual grounding meditation to allow for the topic that we're exploring this evening on compassion. So I'm going to guide that meditation, and I'll ring a bell to start the meditation, and then I'll ring a bell to close it. It's still going to be a very short practice of maximum 2 minutes or so. So for those that aren't that familiar with meditation, don't worry at all. But yeah, just use this as an opportunity to kind of get grounded, tune in with how you're sitting in your chair, and just know that this opportunity is just 2 minutes to just kind of rest in the moment. So listening to the sound of the bell to start. So I invite you to gently turn your attention inwards, either by closing your eyes if that feels comfortable to do so, or simply lowering your gaze and knowing that your intention is to check in with yourself and your inner world for these few minutes. And to start with, just tuning your attention into your breath. Just noticing how your breath is flowing in and flowing out of your body. And there's no particular need to change your breath, but if it helps you to feel grounded, you can give yourself a deep breath or two. If it helps you to kind of connect more into your body, into this moment. And then from your breath, I'll invite you to widen your attention outwards to the rest of your body. How you're sitting here this evening or this morning if you're joining from another time zone. How you're arriving in this space. Maybe just kind of scanning from the top of your head down through your shoulders, through your torso, your legs and your feet, just kind of checking in and noticing anything that's there. And this is an opportunity to observe and to try and bring some kindness to yourself. So if you notice any tensions or any discomfort, just bringing some kind of loving kindness and acceptance to whatever you find there in yourself in this moment. And that might be that you're finding as you look within that your thoughts are racing, or that you find it a little hard to concentrate after the day that's gone. Whatever you're finding, just see if you can bring a little bit of gentleness, a little bit of kindness, and a bit of acceptance to yourself as you are in this moment. And then coming back to the breath, again, just using your breath to tune in with yourself, and just knowing that this evening we've all come together to explore this topic of compassion. So everyone that's here in this event this evening wants to learn, wants to connect, and wants to know about putting compassion into action. And just take a moment to appreciate the beauty of that we've come together for that reason. And I'm going to gently ring a sound of the bell to close this meditation experience and go into the rest of our event. Thank you all for taking a few moments to do that. And like I mentioned, it was a little bit longer than our usual practice, partly due to the theme that we're covering this evening. So we're going to move on to the rest of the event now. We've got 3 speakers to hear from this evening. They're all going to do short presentations, and then they're going to be staying for the rest of the event to answer any questions and join in with discussions. And yeah, really excited. All the speakers have been posed this question of how can we put compassion into action in ways that care for others and also for ourselves. So they're all going to be sharing around that topic, and I think given the kind of wider context of what we face in the world today and the rapid changes that we're going through in society, this question is becoming more and more relevant. So I'm really happy that so many of you are here this evening to explore this with us. So to start with, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, a dear friend of mine. Actually, I feel very grateful because all the speakers this evening are dear friends of mine. The first speaker will be Alex Nunn, who's head of movement building at Action for Happiness, which many of you have likely heard of, which is a movement for people taking action for a happier and more caring society. Alex is a Buddhist and an activist, and also a contributor to Extinction Rebellion, regenerative culture, the Earth Holder community, and also radical wellbeing training, which is the latter being a project that Alex and I are developing together. So I'll invite Alex to unmute himself, and then I'll hand over the floor to you, Alex. And just to let everyone know, I'll ring a bell to remind Alex of time when we've got about a minute to go. So over to you, Alex.
Lovely, thank you. Can I just get a show of hands to check that everybody can hear me, see me? Lovely, good. Lots and lots of nice positive waving. What a lovely way to start. Yeah, this topic I feel so excited to speak on, and so grateful to Network of Wellbeing and to Flow for kind of inviting me into it. Compassion, of course, is absolutely essential. As Darwin noted in The Descent of Man, you know, it's about survival of the fittest, but it's the fittest group, which is the one that is most cooperative, best able to look after itself and meet its needs, that survives and means that we're here on this planet. So this innate nature of compassion is something that is very deep within us, but there's many obstacles to it manifesting in all of our kind of interpersonal interactions and in the systems that we have in the world. In terms of my focus for this very short talk this evening, I've got a lot of scraps of paper on my bed behind me where I sort of threw lots of notes together. I'm definitely not going to cover everything, but some things I really do want to focus on is a little bit about what we mean by compassion, sort of a little bit of a definition. I really want to punch a hole in this idea of compassion fatigue. I think there's a big misnomer about it, so I'd love to address that. To talk about some ways that compassion can be trained, which draws a bit from the kind of the Buddhist canon as well as kind of contemporary neuroscience. And then why it's a good thing for the world right now, which I think probably for this group will be fairly obvious, but is a nice way to wrap up. And if I've got time, I'll sneak in a tiny little practice at the end as well. I know Flo's smiling because of how overly ambitious that obviously is. So let's start with the definition. Compassion is defined as a state of concern for the suffering or unmet need of another, coupled with the desire to alleviate that suffering. So we notice that's about 2 different things actually that come together there. There's one which is a part about empathy. It's about being able to resonate with the feeling that someone else is having, particularly in the context of that being a moment of suffering. But then it's not just staying there. It's about bringing in the intention to heal or to support, or for that person to be free from that suffering, a sense of alleviation. Now, this is kind of where I really want to focus in on this point about kind of the idea of compassion fatigue, which has been well recast actually by Tanya Singer, the neuroscientist, as empathic distress fatigue. Essentially, when we are stepping into a moment of empathizing with someone in a moment of suffering, two paths open up for us. One in which we sort of resonate with the feeling that someone else is having, but take that on ourselves. So we start to suffer alongside that person, we're suffering with them, and we then can slip into a space of identifying with that suffering. That suffering becomes our own, perhaps our own narratives of why we're feeling that suffering, or other sort of triggers can take place. And that creates emotional kind of distress, actually. It's quite exhausting. It can cause us to then kind of want to avoid that person or push away, or perhaps even be confrontational. It's very, very common that that sort of happens. And there's a lot of this going on, particularly in contexts like healthcare, where actually people are having to kind of shut down their emotional connection with people in order to cope with the fact that if they were to just resonate with them, they would be really, really exhausted. And the sad fact of this is that actually as we suppress our emotions, that's actually using up even more of our kind of psychological and physiological energy in pushing those away. So we're actually becoming more and more burnt out, not just from the resonance itself, but also from the tactical avoiding. So what do we want to do instead? We want to cultivate compassion. We want to have an intention to relieve that suffering. We want to kind of, in whatever way we can, generate some thought or orientation, positioning towards that person's suffering that keeps the suffering as theirs. It's very much not about us, it's about them and the situation they're in, that we are feeding into, that we're feeding for, that we're cultivating an intention for them to be relieved of. Of course, it's really often that results in some altruistic behavior of actually doing something to help that person. That's obviously very beneficial as well. But compassion doesn't require that altruistic behavior in order to take place. Actually, the effect of feeling boosted by that, the many kind of positive effects that can come from kind of improved happiness and well-being, improved resilience, improved sense of connection, all these many kind of benefits, increase even down to kind of improved longevity, longer life living, all come just actually from the orientation rather than from enabling it into action itself. So I'm going to check just where I am on time, because I probably, wow, gosh, that's like nothing. Okay, great. Can empathy and compassion be trained? Absolutely, they can. Three different ways in which they can be trained. One is to view the fact that we already have it innately within us, and the key is to kind of remove the obstacles that are stopping it from manifesting. So that, for example, might include maladaptive self-concern, a nice narcissistic self-focus, something that I myself am quite prone to, but have worked kind of through meditation and other ways to kind of help to release a little bit as much as I can. The other is a kind of constructivist approach. It's the idea that we're topping up or practicing or working it like a muscle to become more compassionate. So things like compassion meditations, metta bhavana, these kinds of things can be really, really helpful in kind of building that muscle and building that skill of compassion. The final one is a relational engagement that, you know, actually, although the previous two can be practiced on their own, the third kind is actually really feeling into a direct connection. So it's often practiced in kind of dyad work, pairs of people, in communication. It really helps to practice feeling cared for, feeling compassion that you've received in order to be able to open up that space for others. Three different ways we want to see compassion improve in ourselves are depth, breadth, and frequency. So depth of compassion is how much you can really manifest compassion for a particular person or individual, which will lead you to do more suitable and more effective actions if those emerge from it. Breadth is actually widening it out, so we're not just compassionate for people who are like us, but beyond into circles of people that actually can be quite difficult for us to extend to, particularly, you know, given the context of when we're speaking right now. That's obviously a really critical part of practice for the moment. And then the final one is frequency, which is to ensure that it happens instantaneously whenever there's a moment of suffering, that we don't find ourselves dropping into that kind of burnout, fatigue, distress mode, but instead stay in that compassionate mode and perhaps do something to help people. So the great news is that from the neuroscience that you can indeed train all of these qualities. Richie Davidson, in his book on the science of meditation, demonstrates really well that state can drive trait. If you practice being in a state regularly and often, that becomes your trait, that becomes what you're like as a person. So people aren't just kind of compassionate or not compassionate, you can become a compassionate person through practicing it. I think there's going to be a bell. Lovely. So I'll take my 60 seconds, yeah? So apologies for the slightly uncompassionate rush of information I've just downloaded on you. Hopefully that'll kind of expand in time. There'll be things we can follow up on in the Q&A. Just to recognise, I heard on the radio today that a quarter of UK adults are now in a caring role due to COVID-19. So practicing compassion and knowing how to navigate compassion versus this kind of more negative response that can come from empathizing with people struggling, so critical. And just a small little tip that I will offer by way of a small meditation. So many meditations are focused around the breath. This one is too. It involves just when you're meeting a moment of suffering. This is something I practice myself and I find very helpful. Just to take a breath in, and with that in-breath, note, I'm witnessing a person who is suffering. I'm with that suffering. I'm with that suffering that person has. That's on the in-breath. And then on the out-breath, just kind of wishing for them to be free from that suffering. And it's a very applicable, simple tool that we can use in many different situations. But if we can stay with that, obviously you can repeat that for as long as it takes. It can be very grounding. It stops us from going into a space of distress, and it can often encourage us to provide the space that's needed for that person to process and be with the thing that they're going through too. So I will stop there. I think that's my time. Lovely to be with you all. I hope there was some useful stuff in that. I'm really looking forward to the further discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, just to note, we've given the speakers quite the challenge to fit such a topic into short snippets of presentations. The intention being that we want to also give space for us to kind of explore these ideas together. I see some questions and kind of reflections coming in on what you shared in the chat box, and thank you people that are kind of helping each other with answering. And I saw one particular reference question that maybe Alex can just jump in and quickly answer in the chat box as needed. Like I say, that we will have a kind of general Q&A later in this event for all of the speakers, and Roger's going to be keeping an eye on the questions coming up in the chat box. But feel free to use the chat box to kind of engage with each other, and if you do know an answer to each other's question or want to share something, that's also wonderful, because of course we're all here because it's compassion, and exploring putting compassion into action is a topic that's touched us all. I want to, just before we move on to our next speaker, Ruby Reed, I just want to offer myself a moment of self-compassion and be really honest with you guys. Usually we do a poll at the start of the event, but I got so into the meditation experience that I forgot to do the poll. But the idea of having a poll is that we love to hear a bit about and get an impression of who's joining us and what kind of backgrounds you guys have. So I'm just going to, before we move on to our next speaker, share that poll now. And the question is, where have you been putting your compassion into action in recent months? And this is a multiple choice question. You can answer more than one option. But yeah, I just invite you guys, if you would like to share whether you've in your personal practice, in your day-to-day life, through your work, in your community, in mass social actions, or other, or none of the above, just so that we get a kind of very quick impression. And this question, by the way, will be something that we go into further depth in during the breakout room discussions, but this is just to give you guys a kind of quick impression. So I'm going to give you another few seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll now. And then I'm going to share the results with you guys so you can see who's joining us this evening. So yeah, where have you been putting your compassion into action in recent months? About 60% in personal practice, in their day-to-day life, 70%. The majority or the highest answer is through my work and profession, 71% in my community, and in mass social actions, the smallest, or other. So yeah, thank you guys. That's really, really interesting to see and to get a quick impression. Like I say, we'll dive into that in more depth later. But for now, I want to hand over to our second speaker this evening, which is Ruby Reed. So Ruby's the co-founder of Advaya, which is a community of change makers that are really exploring the connections between inner and outer change. She's also co-founded a project called Eco Resolution, which is a platform for sharing and action on climate change. And she's an experienced yoga therapist as well. So really happy to have you with us this evening, Ruby, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and share your reflections on compassion in action.
Thanks so much, Flo. And it's a real pleasure to be with everybody this evening, sharing on a topic that I find of so much interest and importance in the social and ecological context that we find ourselves in right now. I really love the phrasing of the question we were asked, like, how can we put compassion into action? Because I really love how it brings together the movement of action together with the depth of compassion. And I think it implies this kind of expanded idea of action that's really rooted in the inseparability of self and society, or the inner and the outer, which chimes in quite beautifully with the concept regenerative activism, which is a concept that we've been working on quite a lot over the last few years with another organisation called ULEX Project. And so I'm going to talk a bit about regenerative activism, which is, I think, another way that we can apply compassion, put compassion into action relating to the context that we're in. So regenerative activism explores how to work effectively with the personal and inner dimension of activism. So it's about creating the conditions in which we, our society, and the ecosystems that we're in can flourish. And it takes quite a holistic approach that integrates the personal and the spiritual, like if you could think about it in maybe 3 tiers, the personal and the spiritual, and then the interpersonal and the organizational, and then the socio-political and the movement building. And so by supporting awareness and change at these multiple levels, we can explore a more effective activism that builds purpose, connection, and belonging, but that also nourishes, inspires, and empowers others. So I looked at what compassion actually meant, and was interested to see, as Alex was talking, was explaining as well, that it was rooted in the Latin to suffer with. And it got me thinking about how this chimes in with activism, like feeling the suffering of the world and acting from that place. But like, how can we ensure that we retain our personal integrity? And like, how can our compassion, or our suffering with, retain clarity and movement so that we don't get pulled into the depths of what that suffering actually is and burn out? Like, how can we feel the suffering but work with it through practice or action and transform it, like taking it from one place to another internally, or from one situation to another externally? So I love that compassion isn't just sympathy, it's got that crucial with. And so together with action, it becomes transformative. It makes me think of that Lila Watson quote, like, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation's bound up with mine, then let's work together. So like, clearly there are enormous challenges in constantly facing and seeking to transform like pressing social and ecological problems. Like, activism implies like openness and responsiveness to harsh realities, and is like undoubtedly going to be laced with loss, failure, pain, anger. And like, if we want to face the complexity of all of this, we're going to need strategies that can address these 3 layers that I was talking about, like structure, culture, and consciousness, or the personal, the interpersonal, and the socio-political. So regenerative activism explores how we can build energy and adaptive capacity to root experience in resilience, like emotional resilience especially, and explores how we can stay open-hearted to avoid emotional hardening and cynicism and overwhelm. Like, we've been looking a lot at service and duty, particularly how it's understood in different faith traditions like Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and how we can dedicate our work to the service of others without falling into traps of self-sacrifice, like concepts of dharma or spiritual duty with detachment from the outcome or the fruits of the action, and like developing flexibility and adaptability, irrespective or in equanimity of the outcome. Like, another concept that I really love is enchantment, which we've learned a lot from the work of Sharon Blackie. It's like how we can fall back in love with the world, like ignite curiosity and wonder at the beauty, and build joy and delight in our activism. Like, there's another Alice Walker quote, which is like, resistance is the secret of joy. But I also love inverting it, like, joy is a secret of resistance. And like, grounding personal and interpersonal strategies for change in attitudes of like inquiry, and experience and learning to avoid like ideological thinking. Like I was reading this book by, I think it was Richard Raw recently, and he talks about mysticism as being like an experience, being very experiential, so that it would avoid the ideology of the dogma, and it would retain that freshness. And I just found that really like inspiring as well. So like regenerative activism really explores ways to avoid replicating the patterns that we're fighting against. Like so often you get these like stereotypes of the hardened activist or the like severely narcissistic spiritual practitioner, and so it's just thinking about the interrelationship of inner and outer, and how we can avoid falling into traps of like control and domination, but retain agency and like responsibility. Is that okay? A minute. So obviously it's always a process, and I think that's a lot why it's always going to be questioning, and I think that's why I was so struck by the wording of putting compassion into action, because it retains that sense of practice and experience as well. And I've been talking a lot about activism, but maybe many people don't feel they are an activist, and I'm not an activist in that sense either. But I love the concept of activism, which has been spoken about by another organization called Eco-Dharma, which is at 3 levels. It's like resistance, renewal, and resilience. Like resistance is the action of preventing further damage. Renewal is action focused on developing and creating alternatives. And resilience is supporting increased resilience in communities to weather the changes that are coming or that we're experiencing now. And I just think that if you take those 3 things, that's kind of everything. So we're all activists. It just depends on the intention that we bring to it when it comes to action anyway. Yeah, so I just wanted to share those things to end. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Ruby. That's really inspiring, and yeah, really welcome the invitation that we're all activists in that way, that you, in that holistic way. So yeah, loads of food for thought there, and lots of really inspiring kind of references shared as well. So yeah, feel free to again get involved in the chat box, and I'll also invite the speakers in follow-up if there are particular kind of research or resources that they found useful in their thinking about compassion in action, then we can share those with everyone in the follow-up email, because of course there's so much to delve into around this topic, and we can only scratch the surface this evening, albeit in hopefully a way that connects us and engages us with the topic. So our third and final speaker for this evening is Kareem Ghandour, and I'm going to introduce and hand over to him next. So Kareem is a facilitator at the Heart Movement, which is an organisation that works to make mindfulness-based practices more accessible. And he's also a mentor at the project IBME UK, which hosts mindfulness retreats for teens and young people. And he's a core member of Colours of Compassion, which is a mindfulness community for people of colour. So Kareem is going to share this evening on the power of listening spaces, and I'm really looking forward to listening. So I'll invite you now to unmute yourself and take the floor, Kareem.
Thank you, everybody. Really cool to be here. So cool to see many people I know. What a nice surprise. I wonder how you found this event. Yeah, thank you, Ruby and Alex. It's particularly easier for me now that the foundation is laid of what compassion in action looks like, what compassion is more specifically. And I'd like to explore with you more specifically, I guess, a very specific context and a way of putting compassion into action, which is through listening and listening spaces. A very underrated, very simple practice. There we go, that's easier. And yeah, in a way, a very misunderstood practice when we think of a listening space. You know, when you think of a listening space, you think of a bunch of people coming together to listen to one another, to create an environment of meaningful connection. And I think in our modern society, we kind of equate that with, you know, support groups, therapy, and we just think that's not for everyone, you know, that's just a very particular use or specific context. So I think we kind of undermine the value and depth, you know, of this kind of practice of being together in a very simple way and just listening, telling our stories. And, you know, in a very simple way, we're just creating environments for human connection. We're creating spaces to be together in ways that, you know, the forms of our society don't really allow us or give us permission. And so this is I think it's a very urgent response to what's happening in the world now. So I'd like to explore listening spaces as a response in itself. It is a compassionate action. So listening isn't passive. Listening is a compassionate action that we can offer the world, we can offer ourselves. But it's also a space we can kind of hang out. It's a space from which action can emerge. So it's a space that we can kind of hold and allow kind of the seedlings of change to kind of emerge from. So if hopefully I have time to touch on that too. A little bit like Alex, I've got a lot of notes, and we'll see where this goes. And actually listening space is a core principle, as I'll unpack a little bit later, is called plunging into the unknown, really not knowing where you are, what you're gonna hear. And so I'm gonna plunge, and I invite you to plunge with me. Let's see what happens. So listening spaces, I think, as a well-being practice, are very kind of underrated too, because it's a well-being practice that's more than just about feeling good. You know, it involves a very wide spectrum of emotion, and it's very much a training ground for developing our capacity for compassion. There's no other place to develop compassion as strongly than being with a bunch of strangers in a kind of contained space with a shared contract, and just being there to listen more fully to people's stories. So it is a training ground for compassion, but it's also in the Native American tradition where this comes from. They call it's a way of remembering. It's a way of remembering how to speak from the heart, how to listen from the heart. So it's not necessarily just we're coming here to train. We're setting up a kind of environment that brings out the ways that, you know, are more, you know, in our DNA, of how we can communicate, how we can listen, how we can tell our stories with each other. And it's a crucial time to look at this stuff. Me and Flo were reflecting some weeks back, you know, when this webinar was planned on, you know, the how crucial this is in the pandemic context, where there's so many different experiences at the same time. It feels like everyone is very connected to multiple experiences out there. There's like an extended sense of care, an extended awareness more than usual of how everyone else is experiencing something. There's like a lot more empathy, despite, you know, not seeing each other. We're on Zoom, we've migrated to Zoom. There's also a lot more authentic kind of human connection coming out from the people I know. Those are some of the themes I've been hearing, that people are more real, there's a more depth, a more kind of beauty of human connection coming out. So it's a very kind of fertile kind of time to explore listening spaces, all these different experiences. But now just to acknowledge that we've ended up in a completely different chapter of history in the last week, where, like, you know, the realities of racial justice are just spotlight mainstream in the UK in a way they've never been before, which is very radical. And, you know, just to say that this is even more important now, because we need lots of compassion to feel lots of difficult feelings, to learn a lot of stuff that we never maybe have been exposed to before. And yeah, just that space to kind of learn and listen. So yeah, as I mentioned, I just wanted to name listening spaces. So when I talk about listening spaces, I'm talking about, at the Heart Movement, we based it on the way of counsel, which is a very ancient indigenous form of wisdom that many Native American people practiced and still practice. And we see it in prisons, you see it in schools now, you see it everywhere. And it's really just a gathering of people to come together and share stories and to listen. And because of that, really, there's that social contract to just listen wholeheartedly. It creates a very kind of powerful quality of listening comes out of it, which makes it a practice of community care. I know many people here actually on this call that have practiced this many, many times. So yeah, as you probably are all familiar, you know, the way we listen to each other creates a sort of very much a feeling of empowerment and belonging and connection. So it's very much a medicine for our time. But something, I don't have time to unpack really the whole form of it, but something that's really interesting to look at is actually when we're in the contract of a listening space, one of the key things is we give each person a space to speak without interrupting, without engaging in dialogue, without speaking over one another. And when we do that, sorry, my screen just blanked out for some strange reason. Oh, there we go. When we do that, we're really developing a deeper quality of listening, even if we don't have a mindfulness practice. We're learning how to kind of listen with a lot more depth. There's a bell coming, let's breathe. Thank you. Wow, what is that? So quick. So I was just saying we develop a deeper way of listening, even if we don't have a mindfulness practice. We become aware of our usual habits of listening. We learn to kind of listen in a deeper way, to become aware of our biases, our privilege, our different mental patterns that get in the way of listening. And so with whatever few seconds I have left, I wanted to share with you probably the most important thing I wanted to, which is a framework called the 3 Tenets that comes from a teacher called Bernie Glassman and Zen Peacemakers. We're very inspired by that at the Heart Movement. And it's very much reflects the experience of being in a listening space, but very much kind of compassion-driven social action. And so I just wanted to share these 3 principles with you very quickly. The first one is not knowing. So it's very much about being, when we're in a listening space, so we show up to a certain situation, we're just bringing a mind of not knowing. We're putting down what we think we know, all the preconceived notions, and we're just there to receive what's going on. The second is bearing witness. So we just listen and we allow ourselves to be touched by what's going on, a sense of connection or solidarity or a sense of difference. Maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable, so we let ourselves be touched by that. So bearing witness, it's a not knowing, bearing witness. And then the third practice, or principle, is taking action. So we take action based on not knowing and bearing witness. So that means action comes from a place of just showing up with a completely empty screen and seeing what's there. And then the most spontaneous kind of action arises, the most action that's needed, probably not the action we want to give that we think is needed, the action that's most needed and it's most spontaneous and most authentic. Yeah. So there's something. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kareem, and Ruby and Alex. Thank you for sharing those really insightful presentations, talks. I just to kind of follow from what Kareem has just shared. I wanted to briefly mention, and we can come back and mention this a little bit more at the end, but that we're really aware that this is quite a deep topic that we would love to offer more space on, and kind of following on from what Kareem has so powerfully shared there about the importance of listening spaces. We're going to, the Network of Wellbeing and the Heart Movement are going to co-host a listening space on the theme of compassion in action at the same time next week, so 7:30 p.m. BST next Tuesday. I'm going to, Jazz from the Heart Movement is also on this call, and I'm going to invite Jazz, if you don't mind, to put the sign up link for that listening space in the chat box, so that if anyone would like to sign up, and we'll share it again at the end, so don't panic, and I'll also include it in the follow-up email. But just for anyone that feels inspired by what Kareem has shared, thanks, Jazz. So yeah, for anyone that feels inspired, would like to join us to explore this topic in even more depth, of course we're going to go on now to go into breakout rooms and do the Q&A, but if you're already inspired to kind of have that more in-depth experience, then please do sign up for that. So I want to, I really appreciate everything that's just been shared, and even though it's mildly cheesy, I want to invite you guys to all just give Alex, Ruby and Kareem a remote round of applause. So at the bottom you see a reactions button, so if you can just kind of either clap or give a thumbs up for what you've heard, because it's just lovely, or if you want to share in another way on the video, because it's just really appreciate everything that you guys have prepared and shared there, such rich sharings. We are going to have a Q&A section where your guys' questions that you've been sharing in the chat box will be put to the speakers. Hopefully Roger's been diligently working away there, kind of noting down what those are. But before we go into the Q&A, we're going to split split out into breakout rooms, because we find this a really valuable way to connect in smaller groups, to reflect on what's been shared by the presenters, but also to connect with each other. Like we've touched on many times, we're all here because we care about this topic, so it's nice to have the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit more. And in those breakout rooms, you'll probably be in a group of about 3 to 5 people, and I'm going to invite you to share on these 3 points that I'm just copying into the chat box now. So I'll invite you to just either copy those or take a little screenshot or just make a mental note. Really 3 brief points: introducing yourself, so your name and where you're from, having the opportunity to explore that question that was put in the poll a little bit more deeply, so where have you been putting your compassion into action in recent months, and also where would you like to put more compassion into action in the world? What's your intention? So just kind of exploring more deeply like what's been touched in you in these talks, and kind of in the recent context that we're all experiencing in different ways in the world. Just a few very simple guidelines, because you'll be in the groups with other participants. There won't be a kind of facilitator as such, so you'll have about 10 minutes in that group. So just make sure to kind of give everyone space. You know, you'll have a few minutes each to share. If you'd like to reflect on what's been shared by the presenters, do so, but if you'd like to just stick to those 3 questions, then do so. It's kind of your space, and these are just kind of open invitations. Enjoy this part of the webinar, because it's a nice opportunity to connect. So without further ado, I will split you guys into breakout rooms now. You'll see a pop-up box, and you just need to accept to go into the breakout rooms, and I'll give you guys a shout when we've got a few minutes left, so you've got a warning when we're coming back to the main room. Everyone to the recording, and also those joining back from their breakout room discussions, I hope that you enjoyed having the chance to connect in with others participating in this event. Welcome back all that are joining now. People get a kind of 60-second warning, and some people kind of come back into the main room straight away, and other people hold on for the whole 60 seconds. So we'll be just hanging out to give space for everyone to come back. But just for those that are back already, we're following that breakout space. We're going to move into the Q&A for the speakers. Obviously, I've been inviting you guys throughout the discussion to be sharing questions in the chat. I know that the speakers have kind of responded to some already. Roger's been keeping a really close eye and keeping a note of other questions to kind of put to the speakers. And also, it's an invitation. If you've got questions now that you haven't asked yet, of course, feel free to put those into the chat box as well. But just in the whilst we're waiting for everyone to come back from the breakout room, maybe you can just give again a quick reaction. I'm a bit of a fan of this reactions button, but if you found the breakout room discussions useful, maybe just give it a like thumbs up, just so that we know. Great. Anya, lovely to see you here. I see your thumbs up. Hi. Nice. Wendy giving an actual thumbs up. I like it. Don't worry about the reactions. Brilliant. Great to see that you guys found that useful to connect with each other. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to move on to the Q&A section of our discussion. But before we do so, I know that you've all been having a really vibrant discussion in the chat box, which is wonderful, and I love to see people supporting each other there. And it's also really nice to kind of bring some of those kind of themes out into the kind of spoken part of the event. So I'm just going to invite my colleague Tracy from the Network of Wellbeing to just give a very brief kind of minute or two summary of some of the key themes that she's seen emerge in the chat, so that we can kind of give those voice. So Tracy, I'll ask you to kind of unmute yourself and come on now if hopefully you've returned safely from the break.
And thanks to everybody. Thanks for all of the sharing, beautiful sharing this evening, and for the space actually to kind of connect in the breakout groups. It was really lovely to do that. So yeah, a few things that I've been noticing from the chat. So this idea that kind of compassion is innate, and that we can kind of improve its depth and its breadth and its frequency, and how actually we can train it. It's something that we can train, and our inner states can become traits. Some conversation around the importance of inquiry and around the importance of practice, particularly around kind of avoiding replicating kind of patterns or kind of falling into some of these traps that we find ourselves in. And I love this idea that's been kind of coming up about, and thanks Kareem for kind of raising it, about plunging into the unknown and the listening spaces as an urgent response, and how they can be places to learn, and a kind of training ground for developing compassion, for listening fully, and for remembering how to speak from our hearts. So yeah, some really wonderful and really potent stuff in there. So thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Thanks for that kind of snapshot into the chat room discussion. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A section of the evening. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Roger, who's been keeping a close eye on the questions that you guys have been asking throughout the evening. So he's going to summarise some of those for the speakers. If you guys have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box now, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can within the time. We're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes Q&A before we move to a close at 9 o'clock. So Roger, I'll invite you to come and share now.
Hi Flo. Yeah, it's always an interesting challenge trying to summarize all these questions, and today's challenge was made even more interesting by the fact that all the speakers were really efficient at answering the questions in the chat box as soon as they were asked. So most of the questions that people have asked have already been answered. So have a look in the chat box at those answers. So well done, Alex and Ruby and Kareem, for doing that. But I think there are three that I've managed to sort of spot that haven't been answered. And I think the first one is Jasmine asked, how does compassion relate to interbeing and interconnectedness as well as, and how does that affect how we feel compassion fatigue? Anybody want to go with that? Maybe Alex, I don't know.
Thanks, Roger. So first question pointed to Alex first, and Kareem and Ruby can come in if they have something to add.
Super. Oh, I'm unmuted. Fantastic. So the question's around our inherent interconnectedness. There is a term used in that question, which is interbeing, which comes from a teacher called Thich Nhat Hanh, which is, well, it's kind of self-evident from the way that it's described, but it's about how we inter-are, essentially, that we've kind of adopted in our Western thinking this Cartesian idea of kind of the separate individual, whereas in fact, actually, well, for example, I could say that I am constituted by the words that are currently coming out of my mouth, but these words wouldn't be coming out of my mouth if Jasmine didn't exist to ask that question, if Roger didn't exist to read the question out. So the very essence of what it is to be me right now is evidently part of a network of being rather than an individual one. How does that relate into compassion? Well, I think in the kind of Buddhist traditions, this is often used as a kind of practice. You know, I've just described it theoretically, but that's not the same as actually me realizing that. I still feel like a me, individual, small person talking to a computer screen and a group of other people on the other side. But if I was to practice, perhaps, you know, over time, this idea of our interconnectedness could become more of the norm of how I experience life. And that's likely to produce less kind of individual gripping and kind of personal trauma triggering, and likely to mean that I more naturally act for the benefit of others, because they're not others really, they're me. It's all one great kind of interbeing. So yeah, what an amazing question. Thanks, Jazz. Yeah, I hope I've touched on it. There we go.
Thank you, Alex. And just briefly checking in with Kareem and Ruby if you would like to add anything, but if not, we can move on to the next question. But Kareem, yeah. Oh.
I'm just saying Alex took care of that very well. I don't think so.
Yeah, thanks. So Roger, what's the next question that you'd like to share? And again, I noticed maybe one or two people have popped in the chat box, and feel free to add further questions and we'll try to get to them. But yeah, Roger, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Meg asked, for those of us maybe who come from more very much activism tradition, this is quite an interesting one. If compassion is about action, how does this align with the listening space? That's maybe one for Kareem.
Okay, over to Kareem.
Compassion is about action. How does this align with the listening space? Yes, so compassion is Thich Nhat Hanh teaches us compassion is a verb. So compassion is an action itself. And listening is also an action. And, you know, listening and being listened to are very profound actions that can have very strong ripples, that can be life-changing, actually. But from an activism perspective, you know, sometimes, I guess, as I was trying to kind of pack in that aspect of the 3 tenets, holding that space of listening is sometimes what's needed before that leap into doing something. That space to just kind of listen and see, okay, what's going on. So I guess that's more of an internal listening space, like a listening space we hold in ourselves. But then, yeah, also, so being in a listening space with others in the kind of the ways I was kind of describing a little bit, and getting to know some of our own workings of our mind, some of our own habits of engaging with things, that kind of insight is super helpful for then taking action. That's a lot more heart-centered, that's a lot more, yeah, sincere and what's needed, really. That's real compassion rather than a kind of addiction to fixing and saving, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, listening is it's kind of like non-doing is a very important part of doing. There's like, there needs to be that space in there.
Thanks so much, Kareem. That's really a helpful response. And yeah, again, I mean, I've personally really valued the offering of listening spaces as that kind of reflection space that leads to action, like Kareem was touching on. So anyone that's keen to explore that more, welcome to join us next week to experience a listening space in action, so to speak. Roger, passing it back to you for the 3rd question.
Okay, there's an interesting one from Elaine, which I think is going to make you laugh, Flo. I know you're going to be involved with this. It was a question again for Alex, and that's, what's radical well-being?
Alex?
I think over to Flo on that one.
Okay, so Radical Wellbeing is a project that is close to both my own and Alex's heart, and it's really exploring this intersection between kind of personal well-being and activism in the world. So I think that both Alex and I have worked in the kind of happiness and well-being worlds for some years now, and we've really observed that there's kind of 2 crowds in a way, that the kind of really active well-being crowd that know a lot about kind of positive psychology and resilience and those types of topics, and they've got so much to offer to activism, but they're not quite sure kind of how to bridge over it. And then there's the activism crowd that's like really passionate about creating positive change in the world, but often that can kind of lead to complete overwhelm, complete burnout. And so Alex and I have been exploring the kind of intersection of these worlds, and how can we actually offer some training that helps to equip people to engage to engage from a kind of personal well-being perspective in activism, and to take care of themselves whilst taking care of the world. So yeah, we're developing that in an ongoing way at the moment, and we're just about at the stage where we want to kind of trial pilot our first kind of workshops. So yeah, we can anyone that's like interested to find out more can get in touch with myself, and we can kind of maybe share further about it. But yeah, Alex, if you wanted to mention anything further than what I've shared there, you're welcome.
Beautifully done, Flo. Thank you for taking that one. I just kind of batted it over to you. And yeah, coming soon to a Network of Wellbeing webinar near you.
Yeah, indeed. We'll definitely keep everyone posted for sure. So, I see the chat box has got busy. So Roger, are there any further questions that you want to share from recent questions? Or?
Well, Gemma, I'm not sure, asks, is there a mailing list to get into the radical radical activism work? Is there a way that you could find out more? But I was going to ask something again, maybe from an activist perspective on my own, and that's really to ask all 3 speakers, if there's one book that you could recommend that you think any activist should read about caring for oneself, what do you think it would be?
Ooh, putting everyone on the spot, one book, but great question. So if you don't mind, I'll go to you first on that one, Ruby. Sorry to put you on the spot, but just to kind of bring you in, because you include so many beautiful books in your discussion, and then we'll go around.
I think Adrienne Marie Brown's books are really good at that bridge of like on the topic of radical well-being for one, and the bridge of the like inner well-being with outer well-being. She's written Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism, and she's a really amazing writer and a speaker. And yeah, I recommend her books.
Brilliant, thank you, Ruby, and I'd second that for sure. Kareem or Alex, whoever feels ready to jump in. Alex is looking ready, so.
Lovely. I love books. I've got so many books, and it's a bit of a cop-out for the question, but I think probably different books are relevant for different people at different times. But one book that really struck and impacted me, I forget the name of the author now, I tried to look it up, but didn't quite manage it in time, but the book itself is titled One Straw Revolution, and it's kind of a prototypical permaculture book, but it's written by a Japanese, I think he's a biologist, and then he kind of goes into the military and then comes back, takes over his father's farm, and institutes this way of kind of a very sort of Taoist principle of kind of non-action with regards to the land, and kind of allowing the course of nature to take its own kind of direction, and then over time witnessing far greater yields than have been produced by any of the other forms of agriculture across his country. But it sounds like a book about farming, which it essentially is, but it's really a book about kind of letting go, non-action, and allowing things to take the course they can with slight little nudges here and there to send it in the direction you want it to go.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Ruby, for putting the link to your book in the chat. Kareem?
Yeah. You're asking in particular, Roger, from an activism perspective, but about caring for oneself in particular. I would throw the book. It's a book about kind of, I guess, cultivating inner freedom, and kind of, it's like the meditation path, but it's very much like an action-oriented one. It's called The Fierce Heart by an author called, a teacher called Spring Washam. And she's just a really amazing woman. And she really just talks about her story, and just very much includes like the reality of social justice. She's a woman of color, and just has such a beautiful kind of life experience. And the book is really just about how to kind of reclaim your own heart and find, you know, that kind of freedom to engage with the world. So it has an action-oriented thing to it. I just saw a very good question in the chat. I can jump in. It's very listening focused.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, go for it.
So thank you. That's a very important question. I was hoping to sort of explore.
Maybe just read the question as well, Kareem.
I'm just gonna I'm gonna also put it down in the chat again. So I was hoping to maybe touch on something like that. Thank you. So, okay, top tip. A top tip to be able to listen compassionately while looking after ourselves as listeners. So that is a very important question, because compassion doesn't grow into a mighty oak tree very quickly. Sometimes when we're, you know, listening to difficult things, I can't help think, but especially now, anyone wanting to do anti-racism work, anyone wanting to really just confront so many new realities I've never seen, it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And there has to be a kind of a caution in the way we listen. We have to take care of ourselves. So a top tip would be mindfulness in the listening. So really just an awareness of the body, and just really noticing how we're being affected by the listening, and not stretching ourselves, and really just knowing when to back off a little bit, knowing when to soften it. And then, you know, what's also helpful is if we're in a group setting, it's also a good perspective to explore that when we're listening to someone, we're not just listening on our own. Actually, the whole group, it's like a community care practice. Everyone is holding that perspective. So it's also, what's helpful is to just I guess, play with that perspective that I'm not necessarily solely responsible to receive this. I'm not carrying it alone. I'm not like a savior. I can do my best to receive it, to listen to it, but when it's too much, I can drop it. Along with an awareness of the body, to stay resourced, to stay grounded. Yeah, I hope that helps.
That's really helpful, and again, yeah, brilliant to see the interest in the listening spaces, and lovely if some of you can join us next Tuesday evening. I think that for a final question, I'm going to refer to the chat box myself in the questions that have just come in, if that's okay, because I see earlier on in the discussion and chat, Rosanna mentioned that she thought the references to narcissism earlier were interesting, and wondered if any of the speakers could say more about the topic in relation to compassion. And then somewhat linked, although not directly, but in the same area, is Sarah asking, is self-compassion more or less important than compassion for others? Is compassion for others possible without self-compassion, and vice versa? So I think a few people are wondering about the relationship with yourself and how that kind of connects into compassion to others. And I just wonder if any of the speakers would like to say anything on that as the kind of last part of the Q&A. I'm wondering whether, yeah, maybe because Alex mentioned the narcissism in your talk, or he's handing over to, and then I'm going to hand to maybe Ruby first, if you want to come in on the kind of self-compassion connection with compassion to others.
Yeah, I think it's really is a practice. I think that's something we've all been talking about, and it's like a continuous state of acting, reflecting on your actions, integrating your reflections, and then acting again, and it's always going to be like that cycle of awareness, integration, and resilience. And when it comes to self-compassion, I don't think self-compassion is narcissistic, and I think that it's important to have a degree of self-compassion to be able to not burn out, and to be able to have longevity and sustain your compassion effectively. And I think it as well is often going to be about that interrelationship of individual with the collective, and our actions are always going to be in a process of exchange, and we're sometimes going to need to work more on ourselves, and sometimes we're going to need to work more with others, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It's just a continual cycle. It's just a cycle of change, and I think that we need to be listening to others, and finding out what the effects of our actions really are. I think in the recent events have been highlighting more than many people could have ever imagined how the impact of actions aren't always as you might believe, that the impact isn't always having the effect that you might think it's having. And it's like, how can we learn from the approaches of other people to explore how to build groups and communities that are really expressive of values that we want to see in the world? And I think that is that process of like compassion to others, to ourselves, and to that listening of the interrelationship of the two and the effects of the actions. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruby, for that wise answer. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your wise reflections on this topic in the chat box. I see that there's interesting reflections around, you know, if there's too much self-compassion, does that turn into narcissism? And Anya's commented that true self-compassion, no, it has fewer negative side effects such as narcissism. Sandra has said that some of the most compassionate people are also the most boundaried, so they don't feel resentful. So thank you guys for sharing your reflections on this important question as well. I'm just going to touch in with Alex and Kareem to see if they've got anything further they want to add on that question before we move to a close.
I'll share some thoughts in my closing.
Okay, wonderful. So we're going to move towards a close by inviting each of our speakers to just give a kind of minute summary of their kind of takeaway message or action that they'd like to leave you with after this really rich discussion and sharing this evening. So yeah, thank you all for being with us. Thank you especially to Alex, Kareem and Ruby. Thank you all for your really valuable sharings. And yeah, I look forward to hearing your closings and kind of staying in touch with you all following this discussion. So who would like to come in first? I don't want to pick on anyone, but I will. Alex?
I had a feeling. Okay, 60 seconds. So I'm gonna speak to this topic of narcissism actually, because I've had a very, very direct experience of it recently. Last week was my birthday. It was a really important birthday for me, and I built up quite a lot of pressure around it. And for some reason, I chose to celebrate my birthday by returning to my traumatized kind of 5-year-old selfish self in a way that completely alienated the people around me that were trying to love me, and failed to recognize the ways in which they were expressing their love, and convinced me that I was in a space where I was unloved and excluded from a space in which actually everybody was trying their very, very, very best to make me feel kind of nourished, loved and appreciated. And it's taken a few days actually to kind of fulfill the aftermath of that. What's changed things was realizing that self-focus actually was creating a distance and a blockage to others, and turning things around to actually start thinking about and caring about them. So I suppose my takeaway tip is, if you want to feel loved, you need to love.
Wow. Beautiful. I think someone was momentarily unmuted and I heard a gasp there, so it was quite a beautiful reaction. So thank you, Alex, for that. Kareem, would you like to go next?
Sure. So yeah, just to invite a creative exploration of how can we bring a creative kind of a listening presence to whatever we need to, and a call to action, an invitation for you to join us next week, the same time, me, Jasmine and Flo, in a listening space, to really have more time to explore some of the themes we explored today. Even though we've been living on Zoom, it's a very beautiful practice because the guidelines and the format create a very meaningful and intimate way of relating with one another. And we can really share our stories and experiences about, you know, what it is to bring compassion into action. How are we doing it in our lives now, in our personal lives, in our work? What are our intentions, our aspirations? What are some of the challenges? And really just kind of hear each other. And in my experience, those kind of spaces are very, very strong sources of empowerment. So we really need them in these crazy times we're in. We get to touch in with each other and really find a way forward. So yeah, I really hope you can join us and spread the word.
Thanks so much, Kareem. Yeah, I hope so too. And Ruby?
I guess my takeaway tip would be to find a practice that brings really a lot of joy to you, that can help to build connection between like oneself and the wider world, like a practice such as like the breath, or being in nature, or any type of practice that can help to build the ability to connect to something greater than oneself, and that brings a lot of joy. And I think that can be one of the best tools when it comes to putting compassion into action, and for building our ability to have resilience and longevity in the act of that.
Thank you so much, Ruby, and a beautiful way to finish, closing with joy there. So to kind of follow on from that invitation, I would love to just kind of capture this moment that we've shared together by taking a screenshot maybe of us all expressing however we found this evening, waving to each other or whatever feels good. If you don't want to be included, feel free to turn off your camera, because I know some people don't like, and that's totally fine and okay. But I'll invite you guys to, just for a few seconds, even though it's cheesy, smile or wave, or take on Ruby's invitation to bring joy into, and then beautiful. Thank you guys so much. And thank you again for joining us. Please, we'll send a follow-up email in the next few days with details of the listening space, with all of the amazing resources that have been shared by the speakers, with details of our next webinar. So we're running these webinars every 2 weeks. So the next one will be on the 23rd of June, and we're again going to be exploring community action and the relationship between community action in health and well-being. So really looking forward to that. Love to see some of you there. And just thanks so much again, everyone. And feel free to, maybe I'll unmute everyone and you can all say goodbye, however you would like to, as you sign off.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
So nice to see everyone's faces.
Yeah, wow.
Okay, and thank you everyone that's watched the recording.